Yeah, I'm Lisa Grocott. I'm a professor and head of design at Monash University, and I've just come back from living in New York for the last 12 years at Parsons School of Design, and before that I was in Melbourne as a founding member of Studio Anybody. Yeah, so I was that kid that at school would enjoy getting out what they called speedball books, those sort of books where you would like trace things, and I liked doing title pages, but actually art was my worst subject at school. In fact, I failed year 12 art, and but somehow after going to law school for 2 years, which was a terrible idea, I ended up back in an art school and one day found myself in a design class, and from that minute I sort of knew that I'd finally found my home, because part of the problem why I was so bad at art was I just thought it was about representational drawing and I was never that much of a form maker. But then it was sort of weird studying design and being in a, practicing as a graphic designer, because I always felt like I was more of the ideas person and not very good at sort of form making or, just the aesthetics of design. And so I think for me, like a big part of the way I sort of make sense of design now is this idea of just having a really expansive definition of making, that I think that for decades, we've sort of taught design often in terms of the outcome and the final product, and as if, the sort of object or thing that is designed is what we're doing, whereas I think for me designing was actually always about the process. So this expanded notion of making I have is to sort of understand that design is as much about making fun or making right or making sense or making possible, and I really find that an interesting way to sort of conceive of my skill set, but also to imagine how you kind of reconceive of design education. And I think that that completely plays out in my role as a researcher, because it's a lot about working with other non-designers. So I work a lot with clinical psychologists or neuroscientists, or at the moment I've just started working a lot with the business school at Monash and the people in IT and the sort of Sensi lab place, and just finding ways to articulate what design does and getting people to reframe the expectations of the designer being someone that might come in at the end to just make things look better, but to imagine the role we would play in terms of designing engagement and designing interactions and making sure that there's the capacity to facilitate, difficult conversations, those sorts of skill sets. Which is, I guess, my way of talking about what making is, in that now I feel like I never have to make anything. That in a form-making way, of course I do still make things, but I often work with different sort of play prompts. I do a lot of facilitating workshops with non-designers, and it seems to me like anyone has the capacity to be able to run with a metaphor of what this guy is in some sort of stakeholder conversation, or the way that you watch sort of non-designers be able to, just kind of imagine and conceive of what it is that this head being carried by the kind of pumpkin guy. Of course, there's a ninja, which, sparks conversations about what stealth ways we could strategically do something. And I think because my work is very much from the sort of participatory co-design sort of space, just being able to work out how to draw people in and sort of almost create, embed everybody's sort of creative confidence to be able to bring that to the conversation is part of what I love about what I do now. So I studied design a long time ago. It was the early 90s. So I think my advice for students now would be different to my experience, except this sort of core belief that I have that design is not necessarily about your sort of expertise in terms of being able to kind of craft and materially resolve beautiful things, that I think that a lot of people assume that that's the skill set they need for design. And I was that kid at high school that was better at science and maths and everything than I was at art, but I really enjoyed the sort of conceptual thinking and I guess the sort of strategic thinking of design. So my experience at school was that at higher education was that I actually got good grades, but nobody understood why, because we collectively as a group agreed that my work didn't look as good as anyone else, but even the professor didn't really have a language for describing why I did well. Like, it was sort of a bit like confusing to almost everybody. It was sort of like, well, it doesn't look as good as everyone else's, but maybe, her thinking is good, but no one knew how to measure thinking, and whereas now I think that for me, imagining the types of, students we want to recruit into design, what the world needs is designers that are like really good at empathy and being able to kind of work with different stakeholders, to be able to kind of walk in the shoes of someone else, to really come from a kind of place of compassion. We need really good critical thinkers that can understand systems and the complexity of those and the unintended consequences of the decisions we make. We need designers that, can think in sort of poetic terms alongside the people that can think really strategically. And so for me, for students, I think the main thing I'd want people to think of is not to put this really kind of tiny box around design and have this idea that it's, just about making cool websites or cool apps or something, and it's about this, really, sounds like a pretentious academic word, but, it's this very sort of interstitial practice that kind of runs betwixt and between almost everything that we do in the world, and whether that's the person that's designing the Mikey card, or the person that's designing the service of the whole experience, or the person that's designing the actual trains, or, there's just all these different layers to all the decisions that, designers should be influencing but often aren't. And so I think my main thing would be to really be able to interrogate yourself and understand what sort of quickens your heart and what it is that kind of makes you want to get up in the morning, and then bring that to your practice and not have a really narrow idea of what that might be. So I think when I began my career in like a copyland place, but when with Studio Anybody, when we founded that, I think it was very much about how to bring a sort of speculative art practice into design was how we first started thinking of it. So we did lots of exhibitions and different sort of, I guess, what we thought of as self-initiated projects, and we saw that it was, clever of us that we were doing that work, and that brought in clients that then gave us maybe a little bit more leeway and space, because we could make the case that the reason this work looks so good was because of the speculative, rhizomatic way that could kind of unfold, and that if we had this, overly prescriptive process, that in itself would lead to less interesting work. And there was a time in Studio Anybody where everyone was enrolled in a master's program or, had explicitly framed research questions. And so I think that idea that we were interrogating our practice from the really multiple perspectives, like mine was literally about how to integrate, how to make research an integral component of studio practice, but other people's ones were about, culture, and others were about business practices, and others were about, politics and design. And so there were really different ways that we were interrogating it, but collectively it just created a sort of culture of, I guess, wanting to push design somewhere that it wasn't. And what's been interesting for me to then be in the States for 12 years is that there's no research agenda in the States, or limited research agenda in the States at a university level. But then because of large consultancy companies like IDEO and that sort of thing, that the notion even of design research is actually framed by consultancy practices, not by, the academy. And so it's interesting how it's, formed this whole sort of field of design where you see lots of ads for design researchers, but they're all in a professional context. And it's a different definition of design research than, what the academy would use here, definitely. But it's kind of fascinating because it's also gets to that notion of like, what role can design play in framing the question and the sort of need finding and, not jumping in with already predetermining what the product would be. But what I missed from a distance was watching my Australian colleagues back here still in university, and just as much as it's a challenging research culture to work in for practitioners, it felt like they were always sort of striving to imagine what that would be and kind of pushing for what practice-based research could be and the contribution of doing and making and creating in terms of academic research and production of knowledge, and that was something that I missed being a part of the conversation of in the States, yeah. I think in general, I think a lot of my work is about invisibility as a sort of theme that runs through my practice in lots of ways. So even when I had an art practice, it felt like it was always about things that were unspoken. So it was often about words that were hard to decipher, and this idea of what is said and what's not said, that I think that my professional practice, the sort of contribution I've made both at Studio Anybody and at Parsons, was often in roles that were never articulated. And my colleagues at Parsons sort of tried to describe the way that I would influence the room in ways that were not easy to name. And so I think there's probably just a history of valuing particular contributions that speak to that they therefore become visible, right? That there's a way of talking, a way of acting in a room that maybe gets recognised, and then there's, you know, these sort of behind the scenes ways of contributing that are very different. And so I've been at Monash just for a month, that's all, and the other day, this week, I met with a woman that is one of the most senior researchers and sort of, I guess, leadership people at Monash. Her name is Kim Cornish, and she's the professor and deputy dean and director of this big research institute in the neurosciences and cognitive psychology. And it was interesting how it was just a completely different conversation talking to her than it was with any of my male colleagues that I'd met with in the last month. And so the different ways that she would sort of put her hand on her heart and sort of describe situations and of how she sort of dealt with, you know, the challenges in a leadership role, or the way she sort of, when we said goodbye after giving me 2 hours of her time, that she would sort of express that I could call her any time, that, you know, there's really quite invisible small gestures that she made that sort of resonated in a way that I didn't even know I needed that conversation until I met with her, right? You know, that then you realise the absence of that type of way that someone was talking to me. And she talked a lot about kind of finding personal courage, you know, to do difficult things, and that was, I guess, just to me sort of made visible the sort of invisible ways that people do things. But I think that, you know, lots of my ideas about education are the same, that they're about, you know, that learning really comes from those sort of invisible moments that we don't register. So the courage it takes to sort of stand up and do a presentation, or the perseverance to push yourself to get better at something that you really, your mindset tells you you're not good at, or like, it's all of those sorts of moves that I actually believe, you know, well, there's a lot of research that backs up that this is what makes people successful in life. So I think in general there's not just a gendered, you know, conversation about invisibility, but also just about all the things that we don't pay attention to that ultimately, you know, make a big difference. And I do think there's an advantage sometimes in being able to be the sidekick or be in the background, or, you know, those sorts of things. That gives you more permission sometimes, right? That I could definitely take more risks at Parsons in my role, and my boss could do in his role, and, you know, that type of thing. But he used that in a really smart way too, by allowing me to be that person that had permission. And so, yeah, so I definitely think there's advantages to it, and I also think there's advantages to shining light on those things. Yeah. You know, I feel like a lot of my day job is working out both to my colleagues and to the, you know, people across Monash University, is like, you know, convincing them about, you know, the value of the invisible aspects of design. So it's like, you know, when I met with this woman I was just describing, when I first described my work with, you know, experimental psychologists or neuroscientists or whatever, she was just like, I don't get, what would that look like? You know, and that's a completely normal response. But the onus on us as a community to work out how to actually make that contribution visible and make it tangible, and to be able to articulate that, and to, you know, help other people make sense of what design brings, is, you know, all on us. And I just think that, you know, I was at a designer strategy forum in Sydney this week, and and it was just a refrain that I hear all around the world. This is no way particular to Australia, but a sort of a lamenting that design isn't taken seriously enough, that type of conversation, and that we need to be involved at more strategic levels. And yet there was a wing commander from the Air Force there who was just really great at kind of pushing back of how it was, on design to solve that, problem, that it was up to us to work out how to be visible in those spaces and to make our contribution clear. So I do think that now, or at least even for me, with my expanded notion of making, then how do I really name what that is, but also how is that not just a poetic conversation about, the different roles that design plays, and how can I even visually document what engagement looks like. And, the woman the other day, I could describe a project we'd done that was about learning mindsets and getting students to put on temporary tattoos that, was just a beautiful tattoo, but kind of spoke to this exercise they had done about what connected these different skill sets and how it was their mindset that did that. And then described, that's a very different outcome for them to walk away with this tattoo that we invited them to put on the next time they needed to use their mindset to rise above their perception of their skills, and to put that on when they went to that exam, when they had to do that presentation, when they, whatever it was, and just, create a space of sort of embodied knowing, or, even though it was a sort of crafted artifact, it wasn't one we made, we just found a cool temporary tattoo that worked with what we were trying to talk about.